My name is Mike Bailey, and I was here last year, so some of the faces around the room I've at least seen in passing, and it's very nice to be back with you for what is a very important initiative of Pastoral Care Week. Last year we did something similar, and we had some personal relation, or relationship if you like, to some of the experiences that one of our guests was talking about on that occasion. Today we are here to again visit a subject that is related to people who do have mental problems, and it's great to see so many of you here. It's a great tribute to the pastoral care team here at St Vincent's Hospital to have this pull to bring so many of you together for what is, after all, a very important initiative on their part, and an extremely important initiative in terms of community health as a whole, and certainly the health that is very much a part of some of the units of this hospital. Our special guest this afternoon is Petrea King. I'm going to hold back on the introduction to Petrea because that will be done by a very special coordinator, I suppose, of our gathering this afternoon. I refer to Professor Kay Wellham, who is a consultation liaison psychiatrist and Professor of Psychiatry, and also a Research Director of Faces in the Street here at St Vincent's Hospital. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Professor Wellham.
Fantastic to see an audience like this. Can you hear me? Was the mic on?
The green light was on, wasn't working. I actually first heard of Petrea King, and I actually can't remember how many years ago. It was well over 15 when I was organising the academic program at Prince Henry Hospital Psychiatry. So Prince Henry's been closed for about 12 years. And Petrea King came and talked to us then, and I must say I've been very inspired by her ever since. And as part of my work, we offer all of her CDs. I actually have a complete collection in my office, and we let people listen to them and see if they like them, and then encourage them to buy them for themselves. And I'm also aware both of friends and patients and colleagues who have been down to Bundaroon to her the setting down there that they have special programs, residential programs for people with cancer who've been in post-traumatic stress situations and other very difficult journeys. And I know how much help they've had from those. So it's a great privilege to have her here today, and so great thrill that so many people are here to listen to her. I'm not going to waste your time by listening to me. I'd really like to introduce them to you.
Thank you very much, and it's really lovely to be here and to be with so many of you, and thank you for making the time out of your very busy schedules to come. And please come on in. There's a chair down here. Has anyone got a chair near them that's empty? Maybe when people come in, if you can just put your hand up so that people can still find a seat, that would be terrific. I actually have a long history with St Vincent's, and a particularly long history with hospitals, mostly because of my own health issues over the years. But in 1985, when I was in remission from acute myeloid leukemia and was told that I was only in a remission and that it wouldn't last, I actually found that more difficult than when I knew I was going to die. Because when you know you're going to die, there are things that you need to say and do and get up to date, and I'd done all of those things. I'd literally given my children away to their father to raise. I'd moved in with my parents who were looking after me. I had one of those difficult husbands who insisted that I sign over all my assets before I died because he couldn't trust the will. And so I'd signed over everything to him. And I had my whole life all packed up in this little suitcase, all ready for the big trip. And then the plane got cancelled. And I was faced with, how much do you unpack the suitcase? Come on in, any spare seats up there? Head in that direction. Take your time, there's no rush. And so, knowing how much to unpack the suitcase for me was very challenging. Until I realised, of course, that everybody lives with great uncertainty. They just don't know they do until they do. And I imagine some of you know that life can change in a moment. Life can change in a breath, in a phone call. Life can change in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. And you see, most people don't know that until they do. And so while I was kind of in the transit lounge of life, waiting for my flight to get called, I really didn't know what to do. I was trained already as a naturopath, a herbalist, a homeopath, a yoga and meditation teacher, a massage therapist, none of which I was really that interested in pursuing, because I'd found the whole experience of contemplating and confronting my death and then not dying, I found it a really kind of riveting experience. And so it was my mother who, after 3 months, said, "Have you thought of working, dear?" And it was such a shock, because it was like, well, how can I start a life again? You know, you're confronted with, do you rent or buy? You know, I think I'll rent. Do you get business cards printed? I mean, lots of things that most people would never even think of. And so I very reluctantly went into general naturopathic practice. And within the first 2 weeks, the first woman with breast cancer came in. The day after, the first person with AIDS came in. And both of them had been told they wouldn't see Christmas, which is what I'd been told 15 months previously. And I felt like I'd met fellow travellers in the transit lounge of their own lives. And my question to people has always been, what is it that stands in the way of you being at peace? And, you know, sometimes it was diarrhoea, especially back, you know, for those of us who were around in the early 80s with HIV and AIDS and cryptosporidium and the relentless diarrhoea that some of those people experienced. So what is it that stands in the way of you being at peace? So sometimes it was a physical symptom, and I would use manipulating the diet or whatever it might be to address that issue. Because, for instance, if someone's about to embark on chemotherapy, the foods that will increase nausea, oranges, orange juice, fried fatty foods, fats, oils, alcohol, fried eggs, cheese, dairy products, it might be useful for a person to know that before they embark upon chemotherapy, rather than wearing the orange juice after someone's tried to have it along with chemo. And yet I think we still serve orange juice alongside of chemotherapy in pretty much every hospital that I've ever been in. And all our grandmothers kind of knew this information, but we've lost that along the way, just some of that common sense information. But then, now what is it that stands in the way of you being at peace? And sometimes it was, I don't know who I am. I haven't lived the life I came here to live. My relationships are in tatters. All kinds of deeper issues would come up in conversation. And I found those conversations, and continue 27 years later, to still find those conversations riveting. So it occurred to me very early on that I was living in this place of great uncertainty. And I thought being with other people who likewise lived with great uncertainty was probably a useful place for me to be. And I offered here to start a voluntary massage program for people with HIV and AIDS at St Vincent's in 1985. It took 6 months to get approval, because I must say the nuns were wondering what I was going to be doing behind closed doors. But the very first person I massaged, Tony, was 17. And while I massaged him, the puddle on the pillow just got bigger and bigger. And I was beginning to think maybe this isn't such a good idea, until at the end I said to him, "Do you want to talk about it?" And he said, "No one's ever touched me that way before. I've only ever been touched when someone wants something from me." And out poured his story that he'd been turfed out of home at 15 because he was gay. He came from the back blocks of another state. He had no intention of telling his parents where he was. He was not in communication with them at all. He was full of rage at his family. And I encouraged him. I just started on a voluntary basis again at the Albion Street Clinic, a weekly support group and meditation group. So I encouraged Tony to come to that. And of course, in those days, which is a long time ago, people with HIV or people once they developed AIDS were given 6 to 18 months to live. You know, doctors always work in quarterly instalments. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's given 5 to 7 months to live. And of course, they're only ever talking about a statistical group of people, not you or not a person as an individual. And so Tony, over the next 4 years, attended the support group every week. And during that time, he dealt with a lot of his rage, a lot of his self-hatred, a lot of his own judgment. He'd kind of hoped to be a father himself, and he'd only had 2 gay sexual experiences, and here he was now dying with AIDS. So it was a huge journey for him over that period of time. And when he called me to come and say goodbye to him 4 years later, I walked back into the very same room up on level 7, I think it was in those days, and there was his father holding his hand, and there was his mum massaging his feet, and his sister was sitting in the room. And he was on oxygen, and his belly was terribly distended, and I massaged his belly for a little while, and then he beckoned me down close, and he took off the oxygen, and he said, "It's been an honour and a privilege knowing you. Thank you for teaching me about love. These have been the best 4 years of my life." And you see, on the one hand, we can say that it's a tragedy that Tony died at 21, and it is. But wouldn't it be a greater tragedy if he'd lived to 80 or 90 and never healed the relationship with his parents, never found any self-acceptance, never found any peace within himself? And so for me, all this work really is about peace. And sometimes we have to travel through the caverns of our own anguish before we find that sense of peace within ourselves. Like little Kate, who had a rhabdomyosarcoma of the cardiac muscle, which I'd never come across before or since. And she was 9 when I met her and 10 when she died. And she drew me a picture of Garfield. And in the bubble of Garfield's thoughts were 3 hearts. She said, "I actually drew you 2 pictures, but I put them on my windowsill and the wind blew the other one away." And I said, "What was in the other picture?" She said, "It was exactly the same as this one, but the hearts were all shattered down the middle." And I said to her, "Well, maybe the wind was telling you you don't need to have broken hearts." She said, "No, Petrea, you don't understand. Sometimes hearts have to break before they heal." Amazing wisdom. And just before, I don't know, it makes all of us cry, doesn't it? I still get misty-eyed when I tell Kate's story, and I've told it thousands of times, and she died 25 years ago now. Just before she died, she reached out to the hands of her parents and squeezed them and said, "I want you to love each other the way you've loved me." Because we all know the great strain of a child who's facing serious illness, and they live down the south coast, and dad's at home trying to look after the other kids and hold down a job, and mum's in Sydney with dealing with treatments, and it's a huge strain to put on any relationships. And just to have the space to be able to talk about some of these things is so important for people. And yet I know that often we're just so busy and we don't have time for those deeper conversations. And, you know, in all of the people that I've seen over the years, it's over 80,000 people who've been through our programs or I've seen in counselling. You know, that they tell you with tears in their eyes, you know, my doctor sat on the bed and held my hand while he talked to me, or she talked to me, or some little gesture of kindness. They're not railing at, you know, the bloody doctor didn't have the answer to my problem. They're touched by your presence. Your presence is so important. And never underestimate your presence, because what's the greatest gift you can give into chaos or give into confusion or give into fear? It's not always a remedy. It's actually the gift of your own peace, the gift of your own calm, the gift of your own presence. And people find rest in that, which is why down at our centre, you know, it's spotlessly clean, it's beautifully organised, so that when people come all jumbled and full of fear and full of anguish and full of despair and full of concern, that they come into a restful place that can receive their upset. And so often we get caught up in the busyness, and it makes it much more difficult. And you know, for us, peace is very, very practical. It consists of 4 particular qualities. And for me, these 4 qualities are not just what peace of mind is, they are a profoundly healing physiology. The physiology of anxiety, fear, panic, terror, worry is very different from the physiology that I'm going to describe if you have these 4 qualities in particular. And interestingly enough, when I began looking at some of these people that didn't die on time, if they were told how long they had to live, and some of them are still here 10, 20 years down the track when they were given 3 months to live back then. And when I looked at these people, as a naturopath, I'd love to say they all drank carrot juice, but I'd be lying. It's not about the carrot juice. But they all have these 4 qualities in common. And these qualities manifest really differently in each person. And that's why it's not just about here's the remedy. So these 4 qualities apply equally whether you're dealing with grief, loss, depression, despair, whether you're facing your mortality. Please come on in. Whatever it is, these 4 qualities are a physiology that I believe is downright conducive to healing. And it's simply about peace. We don't ever talk about cure. Healing for me is about peace. Not about, I've known many people who died healed, as I believe Tony did. Tony at 21 died healed of everything that ever really stopped him from living. And I've known many people who were cured of their illness but are still far from being healed in their relationships with themselves, with others. And so these 4 qualities, I think, have universal application. The first, if we want peace, we need to regain control over our response to life. There's a very big difference between reacting to things that happen in life and being able to make an appropriate response. A reaction, indeed, is a reactivation of a physiology that we've experienced previously that we live again in the present moment. And if you think about a time in your life when you really reacted to something, because this becomes really relevant when we're working with people who are in a lot of distress. If you think about a time when you were reacting, and if I were to ask you, where do you feel that reaction? People feel it in their stomach, their heart rate increases, they might feel tightness in their chest, their jaw tenses up, their shoulders, their neck, they get sweaty palms, they go weak in the knees. It is a reactivation of a physiology that we've experienced previously, and we live it again in the present moment. And if you ask someone when they're in the midst of a reaction, how old do you feel right now? They usually feel like a little kid. So we're actually reactivating the physiology of the 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, and we're living it again in the present moment. A response is really different. And of course, we don't say to people, take reactability for your life. We say, take responsibility, your ability to respond to the life that you're having. So an appropriate response could be to get a second opinion, could be to have that difficult conversation that everyone keeps avoiding. An appropriate response could be to adjust the diet or to adopt some appropriate pain medication instead of hanging on to the fear of, I don't want to become addicted, or what if the pain gets worse and there's nothing to be able to deal with it later on. So this becomes very, very relevant for people because they're reactivating from whatever is in the past and foisting that upon the present choices and decisions that they have. The second C is about a commitment to living, which is actually to have a deep reverence for life, to revere the life that you have and live it for the purpose for which we have life, which is actually not about getting more stuff. Although we spend so much time on the getting of stuff, don't we? We think, I'll be happy when I've got more stuff. And then, of course, you've got to dust the stuff. And the stuff wears out. And then we want the latest model stuff, and then none of the cords from the new stuff fit the old stuff until the whole planet is pretty much stuffed. So we need to have healthy priorities. The fact is, you are not your body. You have a body. And you need to nourish your body appropriately. And this could turn into a whole day's lecture, which I promise I won't do, but human beings have been eating locally grown, organic, seasonal, whole foods for 70,000 plus years. It's only in the last 70 years we've started doing some very strange things with our food supply. And plus all of the chemicals that we're putting into and onto our bodies, which are causing havoc in many, many different arenas. So the first one is to nourish your physical body appropriately, to rest it, because this is a culture that wants to soldier on. To exercise it, because it's designed for movement, and to know your own body and what works for your own body. You're not your mind. You have a mind. Now, sometimes the mind can be a dog's breakfast. You know, when it's all over the place, it's forever projecting all our fears, worries, concerns, all the things that might happen, could happen, probably won't happen, into the future. Or we're going into the past where we're resenting, blaming, shaming, rewriting history. I should have done this, I should have said that. And you're producing a physiology to match wherever your consciousness is caught up. And you can feel it in your body. So we need to bring the mind to rest on a daily basis, because something marvellous happens then. We hear from our intuition. That's that still small voice that knows, doesn't think. That quiet inner sense of what's appropriate, moment by moment. That's your greatest ally in life. Certainly when you're dealing with patients, to have an ability to come into stillness. And then you know whether to reach out and touch, don't touch. Whether to use humour, don't use humour. Whether to offer a word or to leave the space gaping. Because sometimes there's nothing to be said. I remember a young woman who was dealing with cancer. Everyone was incredibly supportive. All the other young mothers were fantastically supportive, and cooking and picking up the kids and doing the ironing and all of that. And then it came back, and of course a whole lot of people stay away at that point because she's getting a little bit harder to love now, because there could be a lot of pain and grief on the horizon. And then finally she's on a walking stick at the back gate to pick up the kids, and no one comes near her because they don't know what to say. And then, just as we were preparing her 5- and 7-year-old daughters for her death, her husband was killed in an accident. Everyone disappeared. No one knows what to say. And you see, where does a young mum ever get to say, how can I have given birth to these children and now leave them? She won't even utter the question if she feels like you're going to give her an answer. Because I uttered the same question and I couldn't find an answer. But I didn't have anyone to utter it to. And if you're going to offer an alternative to their suffering, maybe it's God's will. Maybe it's the children's karma. That's why my favourite bumper sticker is still, my karma just ran over your dogma. Because so often with suffering, people are trying to find a solution when a solution is not the appropriate response. Compassion is the appropriate response, a willingness to feel the anguish ourselves and know that we don't have that person's answer. But we're willing to turn up, because love turns up. Love turns up when it doesn't know what to say, doesn't know what to do. It's willing to turn up anyway, preferably with a casserole in hand. But love turns up. And sometimes that's very confronting, because we all love to be able to do something, to fix something. And you all have the balancing act between your role is absolutely to fix it, to change it, to make it better where you can. But there's a whole realm of issues within patients where the answer is not to fix it, not to change it, not to make it better, but to allow them to have the experience that they're having, and at least be willing to join with them in that experience and share with them in that experience. knowing that you might not have the answer and that your own heart might break. But like little Kate taught us, sometimes hearts have to break before they heal. And of course, because of scar tissue, they heal bigger. So we need to have healthy priorities where we quieten down the mind on a daily basis, because your intuition is your greatest asset. And I imagine that any decent nurse and decent doctor here has known that sometimes a little thought comes in, it's worth exploring this. Isn't that what makes the art of medicine? You know, when it's not just A, B, C equals this, but you think, you know, 3 weeks ago she mentioned something, I'm just going to check this out. That's where the real art of medicine comes in, when we have access to that deeper wisdom within ourselves, and we may very well explore a whole area that we might not have contemplated otherwise, especially if we've already got them set in a particular, this is what I think is going on with this person, and we're not open to any other perception. We need to keep our minds in good company. Be in company that uplifts, encourages, inspires you. Don't hang out with turkeys. Be in good company. Company that enlivens you. You know, things are really colourful on the planet, aren't they? The greatest gift all of us can have right now is access to some inner stability within ourselves, and then we might be useful for something. If we're full of our own inner chaos, we're unlikely to be able to discern what might be a useful offering in any circumstance. So we need to keep our minds in good company. You're not your feelings. These are just your priorities. You're not your feelings, you have feelings. And it's fine to feel anything. It's what we do with our feelings that matters. You can feel almighty rage, you can feel almighty lust, but you might not want to act on it. But we can learn to be comfortable with whatever it is that we're feeling, knowing that it's not who we are, it is what we are feeling. And there's a very big difference in that. This is how it feels to be Petrea, feeling rage. It's not who I am, it is what I'm feeling. And then find an appropriate way to express it if necessary. Or this is how it feels to be Petrea, feeling sad. It's okay to feel sad. This is how feeling sad feels for me. It's not who I am. It is what I am feeling. There's a very big difference in that. And helping people to identify with something that's deeper, something that's more eternal within themselves, rather than just the changing feelings that happen, the changing thoughts that happen, the changes that will happen in our bodies. Because if you think you are your body, then when it gets saggy and baggy and grey and wrinkly and bits wear out or fall off or whatever, if you think that's who you are, it could be very disappointing. If you think you're your mind, well, your mind changes all the time, doesn't it? Mind's full of activity. If you think you're your feelings, they change all the time. So if we want to find real peace, the peace that passes all understanding, is to anchor our sense of self in that which is beyond change. Knowing that our bodies will change, our minds will change, our feelings will change. That's to find peace. And peace is the greatest offering you can give into chaos, into people who are deeply distressed, people who just may need a listening ear, an open heart. And you can get very skillful with this. You can turn up at a bedside and say, I've got 5 minutes, and I just got a feeling there's something you and I need to talk about. Can you name it? And then you've put a clear boundary around how long you're going to be there. I'm amazed how effective that is. I saw a fellow in St. Vincent some years ago where his wife was really distressed because she was concerned that he wasn't at peace and he was about to take his leave. And they just couldn't have this conversation. And she felt that he was hanging on because he'd had one son who'd already died, it was all a bit colourful. He had another son who was also being a bit colourful. And she felt that he was not willing to let go because he was still worried about his remaining son. So I spent about 20 minutes with her, and then I walked into the room and he's on oxygen and he's having a really hard time breathing. And I just put my hand on his and I said, look, I can tell you're having a really hard time breathing right now. And so let's not have a conversation. But your wife, she's really concerned that you're not at peace. And breathed for a little while, and then he took off the mask and he said, "Tell her I'm deeply at peace and I'm ready for the next adventure." Back it went. I went outside and I said to her exactly that. She went in, they had a big hug, died 10 minutes later. You know, this doesn't have to, I know we're all incredibly busy, it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It's more about what you carry in your presence and your openness to receive what is, even when that's chaotic. So, I'm going to run through these really quickly. Second C is also about communication, because a lot of us are not in communion with ourselves, nor do we have any ability to communicate skillfully with other people. When I was sick, I used to think, if they really loved me, they'd know what I need. I didn't have a clue what I needed, but... Or I'd walk down the hallway and slam the door behind me and think, surely they know they're meant to come in and find out what's wrong. And it's really useful too to remember that anger, I can always perceive anger in myself or in others as a call for help rather than as an attack. And what happens when we're around really angry people is we tend to go into feeling defensive and want to hit back. And people with AIDS taught me so much about that, because there was a lot of anger in the 80s that was masking, of course, a huge amount of fear. And the universe loves me so much, it sent me all these really angry people so that I could learn it's not about me. You know, we have 4 guidelines in all of our groups. Confidentiality. What gets said here remains here. As far as information, we're happy for that to get shared far and wide, but please leave people's names and stories private. We listen 100%, which is one person talking at a time. It's also hearing the other person's experience, not my reaction to their experience. We don't judge or criticise. However a person feels, that's how they feel. Having someone say, oh, you shouldn't feel like that, is never helpful, is it? Even if you're feeling rage, lust, envy, jealousy, some of the feelings we'd all prefer not to own up to, if that's how you feel, that's how you feel. Having someone say, oh, you shouldn't feel like that, is never helpful. And we stay with how we feel rather than our theories about how things could be, should be, ought to be, how our family, our doctor, society, anyone else thinks things ought to be. But what's your experience? And those 4 guidelines are very useful guidelines for life, so that we carry that into all of our encounters. So communication is a lifelong journey, because even when you think you've communicated really skillfully, it's going to get misinterpreted, misunderstood. So no matter how good a communicator you might be, that's going to happen. And the third aspect of the second C are issues around forgiveness. Such a big area, forgiveness. Forgiveness is not about I forgive you. Forgiveness is an inner process whereby we liberate ourselves from the consequences of having felt wounded in the past. We are no longer reacting in the present. We are no longer reactivating the physiology of woundedness from the past and living out of it again in the present. It's in our history. It's part of our story, but it has no capacity to cause us to react in the present moment. So we do a lot of work around forgiveness. And again, it was a 6'5" transsexual in a frock who stood up at a conference I was at in San Francisco, and he said, I've just realised that forgiveness is giving up all hopes for a better past. Isn't that spot on? It just is. And yet how often do we rail at what is and what was? So forgiveness is a huge journey for people as well. Forgiveness is about getting emotionally up to date so you can be here now and not reactivating from any of the wounds that you might have experienced in the past. And it's good to have a story, but we don't want to be our story all of the time. It's good to have a story though. That's what's often pushed us into parts of ourselves we wouldn't have gone to otherwise. Third C is a sense of challenge. We actually feel challenged positively by life. And it's this one where we make meaning of our experiences, because illnesses and accidents and traumas and disasters don't have intrinsic meaning. If you want to find peace, you're going to need to make meaning out of what happened to you. It doesn't have intrinsic meaning. God's not out to get you. It's not life conspiring against you. And you're going to need to find a way of making meaning. And we all know lots of people who've turned their own suffering into something that's meaningful for someone else to ease the path for someone else. We can think of many, many examples in our community where that's happened. And this is the one where we wouldn't choose to have our past be any different. I wouldn't wish all the things that have happened to me in life, I wouldn't wish them on anyone else, but I wouldn't change one of them. And yet they involved growing up with a completely mad brother who I worshipped and adored, but who told me before he was 10 he knew he had to kill himself by the time he was 30. And when he got to his teen years, I was 18 months younger than he. He went into major depression, had shock treatment, had years of hospitalisations, many attempts that I saved him from. I grew 9 inches when I was 11, and that was the end of my schooling. I went into hospital and had 12 major surgeries on my legs where they cut my femurs and turned my lower legs out and cut my tibias and turned them in, and then my knees swiveled in. They did that all over again. So I had 12 major surgeries over 3 years in hospital and learning to walk again. And no sooner got out of hospital than I got raped. That was my first sexual experience. Went into nursing, which wasn't that bright, given after so much surgery. A whole bunch of other things happened that are a bit more colourful. And Brendan did finally take his own life. I married some very strange people. In fact, one of them came here. I was a bit embarrassed because we were divorced by then, but some of you will remember him. He grew a fibrous histiocytoma on his back that weighed 8.8 kilograms. Some of you remember? He turned up here, incredible, with bleeding and a hemoglobin of 3.9. No blood pressure. Some of you must remember him. He's memorable. Dutch, tall. And they only removed the lump on condition that he had radiotherapy. Never had radiotherapy. He's still with us 15 years later. Still eccentric. And then finally I was diagnosed with leukemia. I was crippled with arthritis also earlier because of all the surgery. So I wouldn't change any of those things because those are the things that have broken me open. You see, the level to which you're willing to experience your own helplessness, your own anguish, your own despair is the level to which you'll be comfortable around other people who are experiencing theirs. If you're not willing to be in touch with your own helplessness, your own powerlessness, your own anguish, your own despair, then chances are when you're with a patient who's experiencing any of those feelings, you're not going to want to be there. Or we put on our busy energies so that we don't even have the opportunity of having the conversation because we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do. And really they don't want you to say or do anything, they want you to hear the anguish. Because once the anguish is uttered, it's no longer a turmoil in my own head. It's now got an energy outside of my body. I've been able to name it. And that's very different from just the agony of what's going on within a person. So that third C is where we make meaning out of our experience, where we are broken open to whatever it is that we might be experiencing. And the fourth C is our sense of connectedness, that we have a profound sense of connection to our own authentic spirit, that we have a sense of place, of belonging, that we have people in our life we can be real with, instead of living with that split reality where we might be someone very privately to ourselves and then the facade that we keep highly polished for everyone else. Did some of you do that one? I specialised in that one. How are you? I'm fine. You know what FINE stands for? Freaked out, insecure, neurotic and emotional. But we want to find that authentic place within ourselves, that inner stability within ourselves, and become masters of our own life. so that you divvy up your 168 hours every week. How many of you feel like you own every one of your 168 hours in the week? See, not a hand. If you don't feel like you own every one of your 168 hours, chances are you could be resenting some that you think other people have claim on. And resentment's a very nasty little batch of chemicals. You know, the whole study of epigenetics will mean that we're going to have to change the way we deliver health care. It means we'll have to stop treating diseases and start treating people. That we'll actually have to hear their stories and help them to deal with what has happened to them in their life, so that we can tailor a program specifically for that person. That's where epigenetics is going to push us, because I think it was Hippocrates who said, I'd much rather know the person who has the disease than to know the disease the person has. And it really comes down to relationship. It really comes down to what happens between you and the people that you care for, and that you are actually the gift. You deliver the gift of who you are by what you do in the world, but your value is not in your doing, it's actually in your being. And people are aching for someone to get them, to really receive them just as they are. And not just perceive them as a body, or not just perceive them as a chaotic mind or a range of chaotic feelings, but to really connect more deeply with that person. That's what we're all yearning for. I had a lovely conversation with Ken outside, who sits and listens. He had this wonderful saying. He said, you need to take the cotton wool out of your ears and put it in your mouth. Great wisdom, so that we actually hear and provide a safe space in which a person can utter what has been unutterable up until now. Because then you find the peace that passes all understanding, and you know that peace is not dependent on staying in a body. I wish scientists would talk to each other. You know, from quantum physics to have a conversation with a scientist from another field, because we know that it's all energy, and that we are each far more powerful than we know. And that when we harness the patient's ability to find their own best answer within themselves, and this isn't medical answers, obviously, because you're the experts in that, but there's so much more to healing than just dealing with the body. We are so much more than our bodies. How are we going to switch off our minds at 3 a.m.? How are we going to have those difficult conversations that become the elephant in the dining room that everybody tiptoes around? How are we going to create a safe space in which people can maybe utter what has been unutterable up until now? Because in the release of that comes that deeper peace, that deeper connection to your own spirit. So all of our work really is based around those 4 C's. Connection can be read at many different levels. For some, it's connection to the landscape. That's how it was for all of our Indigenous people anywhere in the world. They had a profound sense of connection to their environment. And everything had meaning. Every moment had meaning. And yet now we have tremendous disconnection in our society. We're often disconnected from the seasons, disconnected from the phase of the moon, disconnected from what foods are even in season. Because we're so caught up in the busyness. So I would encourage each of you, divvy up your 168 hours so that you fluff yourself up first. By taking care of yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Then you're going to bring your well-fluffed up self to the challenge, to the chaos, to the disaster, to the anguish. Bringing your depressed, overbusy, exhausted, miserable self to those challenging circumstances is not going to bring any real solutions that come from that deeper part of ourselves. And the greatest gift we can give to ourselves and to others is the gift of our own peace. And it's in that stillness that often the creative response comes. Isn't it in that stillness where you know whether to reach out or don't reach out? You might know that something's going on here that needs exploration. So practices of mindfulness, of meditation, are profoundly of benefit because they give us access to live with some mastery over our own life instead of just reacting to everything that goes on. And if you look at the opposite of those four qualities, imagine the person who feels completely out of control with their life. They can only helplessly react to everything that happens to them. That their commitment to living is all around, I'll be happy at a future time when things are different from how they are right now. I'll be happy when I've got more stuff. That they're not in clear communication with themselves or with anyone else. And they have no capacity to forgive or to let go what happened in the past. And they keep trading off what happened in the past and using that as an excuse for their behaviour in the present. That all of their challenges are overwhelming and nothing has meaning for them. And they have no sense of connection to their own authentic self nor to anyone else. I think common sense tells us that that person won't fare nearly as well as one for whom the opposite is true. And that real peace is our ability moment by moment, regardless of how challenging, how chaotic, how critical things might be out there, moment by moment we can make the appropriate response. That our commitment to living is all around caring for this amazing self-healing creation. You know, I've had so many things happen over the years. I was wrongly diagnosed with HIV at one stage because my blood had sat in a fridge for 3 weeks and had tipped off a false positive. I was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer, and poor Fred Nish was very upset and because he said he was convinced it was, but no, it's not. Terrific. I've been told I'd never walk again. I've been told so many things over the years. I know that our bodies are an amazing self-healing creation. If we provide an environment in which the innate knowledge of the body has some chance to assert itself. And sometimes these deeper issues around grief and loss and trauma and the things that might have happened in the past that are still impacting on how we live in the present, resolve those and you set free a whole bunch of energy that might be much more useful for healing. And so each one of us needs to take responsibility so that we care for ourselves as a priority before anyone else, before the kids, before the patients, before your workplace, before anything. First, fluff yourself up. Know yourself. Know what you need to do to replenish yourself. Is it music? Is it being in nature? Is it your daily rituals? Is it meditation, yoga, prayer, whatever it is for you? Divvy up your 168 hours so that that happens first. And then you've filled up your own inner bucket and you only ever then give from the overflow. Isn't that common sense? The only place you see this promoted is on aeroplanes. I keep waiting for them to say, when the mask comes down, we want you to run around the plane and put as many masks on as many people as possible before you collapse. But they never do. They say, when the mask comes down, first put the mask on you, and when you're breathing normally, put it on the children, put it on the other passengers. And yet so often we're all running around putting masks on everybody else when we haven't really attended to our own physical, mental, emotional and spiritual well-being. And that actually takes a very short period of time. I know for some it sounds like, oh, that sounds a bit selfish. What's selfish is being completely preoccupied with those conversations that go on in your head incessantly. You ever have those ones? Where we're rehashing, chewing, I should have said this, I could have done that. You see, all of that completely stops when you meditate on a regular basis, when you practice mindfulness. All of that comes to rest. Now, is that heaven or is that heaven? See, for me, heaven's not a geographical destination. We make of every moment a heaven or a hell, depending on what's going on in here. And so you bringing your well-fluffed up, well-nourished self to the challenge, to the fear, to the anguish, to the despair is the greatest gift that you can give to that person. The gift of your own presence. so that you can hear and witness and affirm another person's reality. Because when that young woman said to me, how can I have given birth to these children and now leave them? There is no answer to that. But it's important that she has the opportunity to utter that and to have it witnessed by another. And that is of profound use and creates the possibility for profound healing when healing is about peace, not about cure. So I hope some of those words might drop into your heart and cause you to rethink maybe how you're living your own life, because we'd much rather you by the bedside than in the bed. And we all want to be here for the long haul. And if I can maybe just finish with one of the reasons this is so important. When I worked in Long Bay Jail a long time ago, had real problems with prisoners with HIV and AIDS. And there were 11 of them, and they were in an isolation unit within a maximum security jail, and they were being very, very naughty. They were flushing their clothing down the toilets and setting fire to the place, and one of them had committed suicide, and there were threats with syringes of infected blood. And I was asked, would I please come in and fix it, and with a view to then integrating them into the mainstream jail. And one of the prisoners there, Bruce, I'll call him Bruce, it wasn't his name, he had loads of T cells. We weren't really worried about his health, but he suddenly developed a lymphoma around his spinal cord that ended his life 6 weeks later, immediately paralysed him. And you see, he was a child molester, and they're the very least favourite people in the jail. And so I went out 5 weeks after he had this diagnosis, and the other prisoners had gone berserk. They'd broken his telly, they'd ripped up his Bible, they'd set fire to his cell, they were churning around, throwing things. One of them had punched his fist through he was covered in bleeding and blood. And so I went in, the officer said, look, we'll just be watching. And so long as you can stay where we can see you, you'll be fine. So I went in and I paced up and down with them, and they were shouting and saying some dreadful things about Bruce. We hope he has a really slow, paralysing death. And in time, their anger gradually came down as my anger had come up, because my son was about 11 at the time, and that was the age that most of the children were who he'd molested. And gradually we got them locked away, and I went from there out to Prince Henry to see Bruce, and I couldn't stand being in the same room as Bruce. And I stayed for about 10 minutes and then went home. And I went and did a meditation just to quiet myself down. And I realised the boys were just being scared. You see, it takes an emotional literacy to be able to say, I feel really scared that what's happening to Bruce with all those T cells could happen to me. And that equated what had happened to him with his crime. He does terrible things to children. I only rob banks, rape women. I don't do terrible things to children. So I could see they just kind of made it okay for Bruce to have this happen to him. And I realised, of course, I hadn't been with Bruce at all. I'd been sitting with a child molester. Bruce was actually just sitting there being a very sick man. But whilst ever I hold the judgment about Bruce, I can only perceive what he says and what he does through the filter of my own judgment. And he lived another week, and I went back and I sat with him and just took on his breathing pattern, which is a lovely thing to do with people who are at the edge of life, because it helps just quieten yourself down. And then up came his head and he said, can I tell you something? Yes. And he said, you know, I was raised by an alcoholic father who raped and abused me throughout my childhood. And I ran away so many times, but docs delivered me back every time. And he said my father would bring home all of his mates from the pub, and he'd hide out in the back shed amongst the spiders, where he was terrified of spiders, but not near as terrified as he was of his father and his mates. And he said, and as I grew up, I began following children and touching them inappropriately. And he talked all the way through his life, right up to the present time. And then he looked at me and he said, but Petrea, I've become a Christian. And I've asked for forgiveness for what I've done to children, and I have accepted it. And there was a part of me that thought, how dare you accept forgiveness? I thought, isn't that amazing? There's a part of me that wants this person to suffer forever. How extraordinary is that? And of course, I didn't say that out loud to him, but when I hugged him to say goodbye, I felt I was hugging as special a human being as there had ever been. And I like to think that when Bruce died, he didn't take with him any of the energy in his being that ever had to have power over another for his own gratification. And he died 10 minutes later, very peacefully. See, the people that we work with are our teachers. We get to learn so much from our relationship with them. And I would encourage you, don't get too caught up in the busyness of what has to happen on a ward, because I know it's huge. And never underestimate the value, the profound value of your own presence, because that is a place where people may find healing that's beyond anything to do with their body. So thank you.